Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
You have created, you and your team, the Solitude and Aloneness scales. Yeah. And it has items like, I wish I had more time to just be alone with my thoughts. If it were possible, I would go out by myself more often. So trying to capture the fact that some people don't have enough solitude.
There are certain circumstances where being alone seems to be the most positive. What is it specifically about being alone that adds to that experience? What is the active catalyst of being by yourself that infers these kinds of positive contributions? Yeah. Is that what we're still trying to work out?
I mean, I could tell you what it is, Robert.
All right.
Save you a lot of time.
Save me some grant writing and paper writing.
Other people can be a pain in the ass and really annoying and distracting and stressful and don't allow you to necessarily be your true self. Welcome back. This episode kicks off a series on solitude, which covers the wide range of possibilities that solitude presents. I speak to Robert Coplan, a psychologist who's doing work at the leading edge of understanding this complex topic. Of course, we talk about the problem of loneliness, but you will likely learn a new word, aloneliness. Yes, the letter A in front of loneliness, which is the mirror of loneliness. Aloneliness is the stress that people feel when they don't get enough alone time. One of the fascinating and useful insights is that regardless of whether you want a lot or a little bit of solitude, you are normal. Loneliness and aloneliness occurs when there's a discrepancy between what you need and what you have, with most people wanting some amount of solitude. And as you might guess, singles often have the freedom to pursue solitude when they want it, and that solitude leaves them unencumbered to pursue its benefits. And those benefits are vast. Personal growth, rejuvenation, reflection, and creative pursuits. And you know my saying for you remarkable solos, create more than you consume. We finish with Robert presenting some ways to explore finding the right amount of solitude. And if you're looking for what to do with it, I suggest you re-listen to Solo Thoughts Episode 5, a new narrative for singles. There are ideas in there that could be helpful. As always, please rate and review the podcast and tell others about this amazing series on solitude. It starts today and will follow for at least 4 or 5 weeks. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Robert Coplan. Robert is a full professor in the Department of Psychology at Carleton University and the founding director of the Pickering Center for Research in Human Development. His research focuses on well-being and developmental psychopathology among children, adolescents, and young adults. His current research projects explore experiences of solitude across the lifespan and across cultures. He's the author of Quiet at School, An Educator's Guide to Shy Children, and is an editor and contributor to the Handbook of Solitude. Welcome, Robert.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited. I say this a lot. I'm always excited, but I'm especially so for this one. This episode kicks off a series on solitude, and I wanted to take an academic look at this, a scientific look at this, to understand what I have now realized is a surprisingly complex topic. And I even learned a new word prepping for this. I'll just give a brief overview. We're going to be talking about solitude. We're going to be talking about loneliness. And we're going to be talking about aloneliness. So loneliness is the way this word is spelled. And I'll be honest with you, I had never heard of it before. And that's about to change. I was telling Robert before we started, I'm a real psychologist. People don't know this, but I'm a real psychologist. I read your work and I'm like, wow, it's really good. You've been doing this most of your career. How did it happen and how'd you get to where you are?
Yeah, so I've actually been working on this stuff for just over 30 years now, which seems kind of crazy to me. But I was trained as a developmental psychologist. And, from the very early parts of my career, I was particularly interested in children who, when they had the opportunity to play with other kids, instead spent time off by themselves. So we spent just a lot of time watching kids at playground and the kindergarten playroom. And we were particularly interested in those kids who, despite opportunities, tended to be off by themselves. And for the first part of my career, our primary focus was on shy children who were playing by themselves because they were kind of nervous and anxious, and they probably wanted to engage with other kids. They wanted to make friends. They wanted to play, but they ended up by themselves because that desire to play with others was kind of inhibited by just feelings of, fear and self-consciousness about being around other kids. And so a good chunk of my career has focused on sort of the causes of shyness, the implications of being a shy child and adolescent and young adult, and looking at how shyness is expressed differently in different situations and across cultures, and even looking at sort of some early intervention programs that are designed to help shy kids. But at the same time that we were doing that work, I also started to get interested in this other group of kids who was spending time alone, not because they were nervous and not because they were self-conscious or embarrassed, but they just seemed to kind of like it, right? So they seemed quite content. They were, drawing pictures or building stuff with blocks. And, if somebody came along and gave them an attractive invitation to go play some games, they'd do that. And when they were done, off they go back to doing stuff by themselves. And that really got me interested in solitude as like a place where good stuff can happen.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, I think one of the things that's, really fascinating about this is this tendency for people to think solitude is bad.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, obviously, it's a punishment in some families, cultures, right? Solitary confinement is...
Yeah. Solitude historically has a really bad reputation, right? Like, go all the way back to the book of Genesis, right? And the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. Right. And there's all these ideas that have essentially flowed from that initial, assertion, talking about all the things that we basically miss out on by spending time alone. Right. So, developmental psychologists would say if you spend too much time alone, you're missing out on all the good stuff that we get from hanging out with our friends. Right. So we know the peer group is this great context for learning social skills, how to solve conflicts, how to cooperate and negotiate. And it's good for our language skills, and even how our brain develops is influenced positively by hanging out with friends. And of course, all the good, support that we get, and, shared intimacy, and all the, the fun that we have from being with our friends.
Having sex with people is fun.
Yeah, indeed. But I think the concern among, especially among younger kids, is that if they're spending too much time alone, they're missing out on these opportunities, right? And that over time, they're going to kind of fall behind on acquiring these skills and practicing their skills. And that could kind of, lead to difficulties later on. And we also know, generally speaking, humans evolve to be in groups, right? That is part of the human condition. We are generally happier when we are together. From an evolutionary perspective, it protects us from predators. It gives us access to shared resources, helps us with food, even reproduction, right? So there are good reasons why, humans tend to form in group. And, I think one of the problems is that, all these things are true, and I would never dispute them. But it's just been too much of a one-sided discussion, right? Yes. So there's been all this talk about, the negative aspects of solitude and what happens when you spend too much time alone. And I'm sure we'll talk about there are negative implications related to that. I guess we're just trying to push back a little bit that that's not the only thing that we should be focusing on.
I love it. That's why you're here. That is why you're here. So to preview this, I want to do some definitions.
Okay.
Then let's talk about some of those costs, because people will be familiar with them from their own, some from their own experience, and then certainly from headlines and news reports and so on. And then we'll talk about some of the benefits and some of the predictors. And
okay.
We'll see. This might end up being a two-parter. This happens sometimes. Let's talk about some definitions. How do you define solitude? And then let's do a little bit of a lesson on science.
Okay.
So there's a definition, and then what researchers do is they operationalize something. Sure. And there's controversy around these two things, yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So
let's go with your definitions and operations.
So the first thing I think that has become really clear to me, especially after studying this for a while, is that for something that seems like it should be fairly simple and straightforward to define and measure, solitude is actually really complicated. And so let me explain why. So some people think about solitude as a physical separation from others. Okay. So like you have this classic picture of a man on a deserted island, and that's everybody's kind of first thing that pops to mind when they really think about solitude. But even if we go with the very what seems like objective definition of a physical separation from others, it's still not really clear, like, how far apart do you actually have to be from someone to be considered alone? Right? Is it just out of sight? Is it that you can't hear anybody and they can't hear you? If you are a teenager at home with your family with the door closed, are you alone?
Yes.
Right? And this also gets at the idea that, solitude may be more than just...
The door needs to be locked.
Right, the door, right. If it's not locked, if somebody could come in, right? So we've got all these issues around just a physical definition, but then some people think about solitude more as like a perceived, a perception, right? Like a state of mind, right? So you can be alone in a crowd. Right? Adolescents will tell us they feel alone and lonely sitting at the dinner table with their parents, right? So that's more about, people sit in a crowded coffee shop and they like the sort of the ambient sociability, but they might consider themselves to be alone. And again, there's no real agreed upon definition about at what point are you no longer alone. And of course, to make things even more complicated, now we have these technologies that allow us to be physically alone, but virtually talking to like a whole bunch of different people.
Indeed.
Right. So you and I are chatting for a podcast right now and we can see each other's faces on the screen. But I mean, you're alone in your room over here and I'm alone in here. But, how alone are we? Right.
I'm in my closet.
Yeah.
That's how alone I am right now.
Yeah, fair enough. Right. But again, we can see each other and we're having a conversation, virtually face to face. And when we've asked teenagers about it, they will tell us that doing this, talking face to face with a friend on a screen, is something that they do when they are alone. Right. So as far as they're concerned, they're alone. But, again, would a psychologist define that as truly being in solitude if you're having a face-to-face virtual conversation with someone?
If I may, just for a moment. So for the listener, they're like, okay, just tell me what it is. But I think this is important because if you do research on this and you write a paper, the people who are reviewing the paper, they care very much about what the definition is and how you measure this thing because it changes. A change in definition or change in measurement can change the conclusions that you draw, can call into question the veracity of your findings and so on. So this is an important, nerdy subject.
Yeah. But again, sometimes people don't even define it that clearly even when they measure it. So the most common way that solitude is measured is, you'll ask someone, how much time alone did you spend in the last week?
I see.
And that's it. Without a definition, you'll let them decide how much time they consider themselves to be alone.
Okay. Yes,
right?
Of course, right.
Whereas other people will make a very strict definition and make you spend time alone, right? So put you in a room with the door closed and no technology for, some period of time and say that is true, sort of the purest form of solitude.
Yeah. That seems unfair, if I may, for a second, because what if the experimental treatment was we're going to have you in a group and the treatment is you have to go to a rave?
Right. Okay.
Right. Or you have to be in a room packed with 25 people.
It's like the most extreme form is what you're saying.
That's right.
And not surprisingly, people hate that. Okay. So there's this great study that was done a few years ago with American undergraduate students where they were made to sit in a room for 15 minutes alone with no tech. They just a chair. They were supposed to be alone with their thoughts. Okay? So they hated it. And not only did they hate it, they hated it so much that the majority of the participants would rather self-administer a painful electric shock than sit in that room for 15 minutes.
You know what? I've always hated that study.
Do you?
I just hate that study because it gets interpreted in the wrong way.
Yeah.
Because I think, because imagine if you said this, we're going to pack you into a subway car.
Right.
Shoulder to shoulder with people. Yeah. Would you rather that or self-administer a shock to yourself?
Right. But the solitude is almost secondary to that effect because to me, it's just boredom. You're asking people to do absolutely nothing for 15 minutes, right? And that's not what solitude is for most people. In fact, we know from some of our own work that doing nothing while alone is about the least frequent thing that people report doing when they are alone.
We're going to return to that, and I appreciate this actually previews some of the future episodes that we're doing where we dive into what do people do with their solitude. And no one says, I just sit in a room for 40 minutes doing nothing. And if they do, they're meditating with a design purpose.
Absolutely.
Okay. So how do you define solitude and how do you measure it when you do your studies in general, at least?
Yeah. So I would say we use some kind of combination of physical separation and perceived separation. And we are also guilty sometimes of just asking, adolescents and young adults, tell me how much time you spent alone. And we do give them some definition, not around other people and not sleeping, right? That's generally how we would sort of define it. And I think there is sort of a consensus about what alone means and solitude means among the general population. And so I think that's what we try to take advantage of.
Excellent. Okay. So if I could just recap, there's some element of the physical separation from others, and then there's some element of like what you're doing with that time.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned you're going to have, a later discussion about what people do when they're alone. We asked a big sample of high school students what they did when they were alone over the last week. And not surprisingly, screen time was the number one choice by a lot. But there's so many different kinds of screen time, right? So some of them talked about, video games. Some of them talked about scrolling the web. We're more actively texting with friends. And like I said before, even video chatting, with friends, FaceTiming with friends was something that adolescents defined themselves as an activity that they could do while alone, which really makes us, think about, we have to really examine what solitude might mean in this age where you're no more than a glance at your phone away from, having social interaction with someone.
Indeed. And I think masturbation was next on that list, probably.
But I'm not sure they're admitting that on the survey.
So let's talk about two other terms that have already come up, loneliness and aloneliness.
Right.
And so let's just talk about those, and we'll get to the connection to them later.
Sure. Okay. So loneliness is probably the most typical feeling that you get if you spend too much time alone. And again, almost all previous research on solitude has focused on what happens if you get too much solitude. Okay. And typically loneliness is basically, it's like a dissatisfaction with your social life. Okay. So, and importantly, it's a combination of being dissatisfied with how much time you're spending with others, but also the quality of that time.
Yes. Okay.
Right. So, you could feel lonely, in a room full of people. You can feel lonely, like I said before, at the dinner table with your parents if you're a teenager. So it's not just being around others that makes you feel less lonely. It's also the sort of the quality of your experiences with them, the quality of that social interaction. So it's important to think of loneliness as kind of like a discrepancy, right? The discrepancy between how much and the quality of social experiences that you would like, and then how much you're actually getting. And anytime that there's a discrepancy in the wrong direction, right, you feel lonely. And loneliness sucks. Okay. Loneliness, it's been compared to physical pain in terms of, how it impacts upon us. It has short-term and long-term implications for our mental health and even our physical health. Long-term social isolation and loneliness predicts cardiovascular problems and even mortality. Okay. So, of course, I want to talk about the other side of the coin and some of the positive aspects of solitude, but, we can't dismiss the negative components. And as we'll see, I think most people would advocate some kind of a balance there, but, we can't dismiss the huge amount of evidence suggesting that loneliness it just sucks and it's really bad for us, right? I don't want that message to be lost as when we shift into our discussion of the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I'd like to rebalance this too. And so there's this term, and I'll admittedly, I'd never heard of it before. This is how out of balance things are. Right. Is a loneliness.
Oh, the reason why you hadn't heard of it before is that I just made it up last year. So it's brand new. This is a new concept that we have introduced into the literature. And we conceive of it as kind of like the mirror image of loneliness, right? So whereas loneliness is this discrepancy between your desired social life and your actual social life, we conceptualized as aloneliness as the discrepancy between how much time you would like to spend alone and the quality of that alone time and how much time you actually get to spend alone.
Okay.
Right? So, people think about loneliness as the failure to meet the need to belong, right? The need to belong is thought of as this inborn need of humans to affiliate with others. And if you're not, then there's the longing or pain that you'll feel as a result of not meeting that need. So again, we thought of aloneliness as the failure to meet the need for solitude. And some people have argued that just like we have a need to belong and a need to be with others, we also have a need to spend time by ourselves. And I think the important thing about both of these terms, both loneliness and aloneliness, is they both are about a discrepancy. Yes. Okay. So there's not an absolute amount of time that everybody should be spending alone or should be spending with other people. And anyone who is telling you that is full of crap. Okay. Yes. Because it's different for everybody. Everyone has their own just right amount. Okay. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we talk about for solitude is that we think it follows what we would refer to as the Goldilocks principle, right? So the Goldilocks principle for any kind of psychological phenomena is that it's possible to have too much. It's possible to have too little, just like the size of the chair or the size of the bed in the story. And for every one person, there is that just right amount. But that just right amount is different for everyone. And that's, sort of the challenge is to find that balance where you can, find just the right amount of social interaction interaction not to feel lonely, and just the right of solitude to not feel alone.
Yes, well said. My goodness. I'm so thrilled right now. I mean, I have to say, like, there should be people listening to this saying, hallelujah, like, I am not a freak.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that we sort of hope to bring to light is that, when we started researching this phenomena and asking people about it, just like loneliness is associated with negative outcomes, like, poor mood and stress, it turns out aloneliness is also similarly associated with these kinds of negative outcomes, right? So people who are not getting enough time alone are more prone to feeling stressed. They're more prone to feel negative mood, even symptoms of depression. And for a lot of people, if they're not even aware that this is a thing, they might be walking around feeling kind of grumpy or feeling kind of sad and have no idea that, they need to maybe pay a little bit more attention to their balance between their time with others and time alone. And if that balance is off in either direction, it can cause these kinds of negative feelings.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I just want to reiterate something you said that I think is important, which is wherever that kind of peak amount is differs.
For everybody. That's 100% right.
And I'm guessing, differ depending on where you are in life.
Yeah, it could. Yes. And that's an unanswered question so far as loneliness goes, because literally we've just started looking at that thing, over the last year or so. But yes, you would predict that it would change as a function of where you are, what age you are, what your life circumstances are. And we'll talk about later, maybe your personality,
that's right?
Maybe what culture you're living in. There are all these other kinds of factors that are likely going to be associated with these things.
Yeah, this is excellent. And so, last thing is you have created, you and your team, the Solitude and Aloneness scale, me. And it has items like, I wish I had more time to just be alone with my thoughts. If it were possible, I would go out by myself more often. So trying to capture the fact that some people don't have enough solitude.
Yeah, that's right. And every item on that scale, which we've spent some time developing now and looking at, how the items go together and are they measuring what we think it's measuring and all the kind of the scientific, nerdy, psychometric analysis that you're supposed to do when you create a new measure. But content of all of the items is always supposed to be reflecting that discrepancy. I wish I could have more. I wish I could have. And one of the things that makes us feel like we've measured what we think we're measuring, which is that's the validity of our scale, is that loneliness is not associated with the overall amount of time that you spend alone. And we don't think it should be because, again, it differs for everybody, but it is associated with the desire to spend more time alone, the plan to spend more time alone, and having more positive attitudes towards solitude, which are all things that we think would make you more likely to not get enough solitude.
All right, I want to say this again. So responses to the Solitude and Aloneness scale are not correlated with the amount of time you spend
with
alone.
The overall amount of time alone. That's right. And which is what we kind of hope for, because it's not about more or less time alone. It's whether or not that amount of time alone meets your specific personal need, your personal threshold.
Right. That's great. And when I say correlate, this first for the lay person here, it just means there's typically, between two variables, there may be a positive association. As one gets higher, so does the other one. There may be a negative, right? As one gets higher, the other one gets lower. Or there may be none. So movement on one has no influence on movement on the other. And what Robert's saying is responses on this scale, whether it's high or low, has no relationship between how much time you spend alone.
Yeah. And actually what we found is that it's, you have to look further than just the amount of time spent alone. So people who spend less time alone but have a positive attitude towards solitude, that's the group that ends up reporting the most loneliness, right? As we would expect.
All right, so that's excellent. I think I've got this. This is about discrepancies. I think people know enough about loneliness. It's been well documented. It's clear loneliness can be a problem, no doubt, especially, as you mentioned, people who don't want to be alone, people who are lacking connection and the problems that can cause for them. But let's talk about, and this is what I'm most interested in, and this is what I think people don't know, don't think about, and is completely overlooked, certainly in the popular world, and it seems like until you folks came along in the world of academia, which is what are some of the benefits of solitude?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the idea that solitude can be a good thing also has a long history, right? There's tons of very passionate essays written by, poets and philosophers and, even psychologists talking about all the good stuff that, how solitude should be good for us and how it can allow us opportunities for self-reflection and, religious experiences and creativity and restoration and exploring your identity, trying on, and so people have talked, and personally, I believe that this is all true. When I got into the study of solitude from this, angle, I was a little bit surprised that, in terms of research support, like the empirical evidence that you would use if you were trying to justify these assertions from a scientific standpoint, is still pretty lacking, and that's one of the reasons why we've become increasingly interested in this approach and this perspective, because personally, I know it's true. and what we're trying to figure out is how can we show it, right? How can we demonstrate it? How can we prove it? What evidence can we use to demonstrate some of these positive components? And I guess one of the challenges that people have been having is we still don't really know what the active ingredient of solitude is. So what is it specifically about solitude that infers positive benefits? So let me see if I can illustrate that. So there's lots of research to suggest that being alone in nature is good for us. Okay. And that's actually, there's really good research, right? Go for a walk in the forest and your breathing slows down and you get less stressed and your heart rate slows down, and it's good for a reset. It's good to relax your attention. You're not always focusing on quickly changing things in your environment. Just everything kind of slows down in a good way. Okay. But the problem is, you don't actually have to be alone to get those benefits, right? So people have done studies where you go walk with, 2 people, a group of 5 people, and there still seems to be benefits from being in nature that don't have anything to do with being alone. Okay. So we don't know specifically what being alone adds to that, right? Also, people talk about, mindfulness meditation, and there's great and growing literature to suggest that this is also a really good thing for us, and that practicing, having a mindful approach to life, practicing mindfulness meditation reduces stress and it's good for our well-being. But again, if you are good at mindful practice, you should be able to engage in mindful practices even in a crowded room and reap the benefits from those experiences, even if you're not alone. So again, what is it specifically about being alone that adds to that experience? What is the active catalyst of being by yourself, that infers these kinds of positive contributions? And that's what we're still trying to work out.
Yeah, I can tell you what it is, Robert.
All right.
Save you a lot of time.
Save me some grant writing and paper writing.
Other people can be a pain in the ass and really annoying. And distracting and stressful and don't allow you to necessarily be your true self.
Yeah. So I'm being cheeky, of course. No, but actually, you've actually gotten at what we have come to learn in recent years might be a really important contributing factor. Okay, and that is, there are certain circumstances where being alone seems to be the most positive, and those circumstances seem to have a lot to do with your motivation for being alone and what you're doing when you're alone. Okay. So in social psychology, people talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Okay. So an extrinsic motivation is something kind of more from the outside. You're doing in an activity because you're following the rules, or you are doing it because you're scared not to, or you're avoiding punishment, right? So when I was young, I took a lot of piano lessons and I hated practicing and I hated playing scales, but my parents made me. And my teacher made me, and I just couldn't see what the good in it was. And so I did it, but I did it as little as possible, and I don't really feel like I got anything out of it. Okay. Now, let's contrast. Intrinsic motivations, you do something because you want to, it's meaningful for you, you're engaged in what you're doing, you can see the purpose, you're trying to improve yourself, it's enjoyable. Okay. So when I got a little bit older, I started hearing songs on the radio, and I was like, oh, I want to play that song. And then I would sit down to try to play it, and my fingers wouldn't move fast enough. And then I was like, oh, that's why I have to play scales. And then I would go and practice every day because it was a purposeful activity for me that I could see the positive aspects of. And then I was internally motivated to do it. Okay. Now that's a bit of a segue, but just to get us back to solitude, it turns out that when you are engaging in solitary activities that are meaningful for you, that are intrinsically motivated, that's when solitude seems to offer the most positive outcomes.
Yeah. So this reminds me of a story I heard about Eddie Van Halen.
Okay.
Right. So one of the great rock guitarists.
Yeah, of course.
And there was a story, his brother who played drums,
all right,
would leave in the morning for work or school or something like that. And Eddie would be sitting on the edge of his bed playing guitar. And then 8 hours later, his brother would come home and Eddie was sitting on the edge of his bed playing guitar. You know what I mean?
Sure.
If you need an argument about the benefits of solitude, is you don't become one of the great rock guitarists.
Right.
Right. Without spending hours alone working on your craft in that sense. And this actually previews a future episode that I do with Mason Curry. Mason wrote a really delightful book about the daily habits of great artists, scientists, and so on. And almost across all of them, there is some element of solitude within their practice, within their creative practice.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were talking about how, solitude is good because people are a pain in the butt. But I mean, a part of the idea of being in solitude is that it is a relief, and a release from the demands of being around other people, right? So most people are very aware that when they are with others about people's perceptions about them, they think about how other people are looking at them, are thinking about them, are acting towards them, and they're always trying to gauge their own behaviors to fit into whatever those, perceived needs are. And that's exhausting.
This is Zoom fatigue.
Right. Yes. Right. So, if you're staring at yourself while you're having a conversation with someone else, you're always hyper aware of, what do I look like to this other person? What are they thinking about? And a lot of people, especially people who tend to be a little bit more socially anxious or self-conscious, they have those kind of evaluative concerns. A lot of time and energy put into thinking and worrying about what other people are thinking about them. Okay. And solitude is a respite from that, right? It's a relief from being around others if that can cause a strain for you. And it's also a chance to be the, master of your domain, right? So you're in charge. You're doing what you want, right? You're doing when you want it. And there is, that type of control and that type of, steering the ship can be again, a great relief for people.
When I teach, it's exhausting. And I'm an outgoing, extroverted, energetic teacher, but part of what gets me so exhausted is just it's such a highly evaluative situation.
Right.
Also, I don't always want to wear pants. And,
Zoom works for you then. You're like, this is the benefits of the pandemic, right? So,
I don't.
And don't show me. I don't want to know. Don't ask, don't tell.
Exactly. Okay, so let's recap a few of these things, right? So one is, it sounds like solitude can remove distraction, stress, anxiety. It can then also add flexibility, freedom, opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. Those are two elements. Is there something else that it does that?
Yeah. So one thing we also know about solitude is that it takes the edge off of our emotions. Okay. So being in solitude doesn't necessarily change. The technical term is like the valence of your emotion. It doesn't make your emotions more positive or more negative per se. It makes them less intense.
Oh.
Okay. Huh. So if you are feeling like agitated and jumpy, right, it'll kind of calm you down. So it's like it's taking the edge. That's the best way I can think to describe it is it like takes the edge off your emotions and makes them less intense, both positive and negative, which can be a good thing, right? It's like decompression in that way.
Yeah, we've all said, I just need to be alone.
Right.
Right? You're pissed off.
Yeah.
And so what happens is, like, when you're happy, you don't often want to withdraw. You want to lean in and celebrate and so on. Yeah. But when you're angry or stressed I have this happen. I'm like, I just need a little time to myself. I just need to get this sorted.
Yeah.
And someone who might be well-meaning is trying to help you cope and soothe you and so on.
Yeah. And I have to say that's part of the message we're trying to get out around the concept of loneliness. So, especially during the pandemic, of course, many people are thrust into solitude that is unwanted and it's resulting in, serious difficulties with loneliness and depression. But other people are thrust into situations where they can't get a second for themselves. Right. So if you are, a working parent of young children who are learning at home, and you and your partner are both at home, and everybody's in the same space, you can't, and then let's say there's 4 of you in the house and 3 of them are raging extroverts, and you're trying to get a little time for yourself, and they're looking at you like you're an alien because they don't understand. What do you mean you need time by yourself? Mm-hmm. Time by yourself is what we do as a punishment. That's not something that they don't understand that it can also be a reward. Yeah. Right. There's all these sort of paradoxical parts of solitude. You mentioned it's a, time out for toddlers and solitary confinement, but it's also like a reward, me time, when you've had a busy day and you want to go do it, right? Solitude is something that is normal. It's something that we all experience across our lifetime, but it's also a symptom of psychopathology, right? Like, mental illness can be predicted by time in solitude. Is a result of too much solitude can be a symptom of mental illness, but it's also kind of a normative behavior. right? So it could be good, it could be bad, it could be normative, it could be sign of psychopathology, it could be a reward, it could be a punishment, all kind of at the same time, which makes it a really complex topic, right? Like it's got so many different sides, and probably the most important message I would say to your viewers is that the reason for this is because all types of solitude are not created equal, right? And and this will kind of lead us into some of the causes, I guess, of solitude, is because what causes you to spend time alone is a critical predictor of your experience of that time alone.
So I want to reflect on two things before we move on. So this reminds me of a story. I have a very good friend, happily married, 3 wonderful children. And I remember him telling me one day how happy he gets when his flight gets delayed.
Yeah.
So he suddenly has a 1 to 3 hour block of time that wasn't anticipated. And he says he goes to the bookstore at the airport and buys a book and sits and reads.
Been there, done that many times. Right. So, but I think that's a really important message for if you're in a relationship with someone. It's not an indication of a poor quality relationship if you want to spend some time by yourself sometimes.
That's right.
And I think, that should be a normalized message. And that should be something that, people should be able to say to each other without having it negatively impact upon the quality of the relationship, right? It's okay. And that's a general message for everybody, right? It's okay to ask for some time alone. It's okay to take that time alone. And not everybody can go for a 2-hour walk in the forest every day. But what we found is that even like micro moments, even small little snippets, right? Just a chance to catch your breath, step outside, go into your closet, I guess, if it's, and take it just a few moments of me time, a moment for yourself can really go a long way towards kind of like, recharging your battery and giving you the energy you need to face the rest of the day.
Indeed. I used to do these. I'm an extroverted guy. I've become sort of less so as I've gotten older. By the way, I am one of those people who likes to be alone in a cafe.
Yeah.
That's like my happy place.
Yeah.
Like the energy of the space and the people watching and so on. But I've got work to do.
Right.
That I want it to be.
That is an extrovert trait, right? You want that ambient sociability, just sort of the noise and the background stuff that's going on. It feeds you a little bit while you're doing your work.
Indeed,
because most extroverts are quite averse to spending time alone. Like for them, it's kind of a draining experience, right? So if you are really extroverted and you want to get yourself going and you want to, get revved up, you go and be among people, and that gives you energy. And being alone is almost the opposite. It drains that energy, and you could do it, but it's not, it's kind of tiring for you. And introverts are often the opposite, right? So they will be among people. They don't necessarily feel nervous or anxious, but it's just tiring after a while. And then if they want to recharge their battery, they go off, they need a break from all that stimuli, so they go off by themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should just cover this now since we're on it, but I think that this is important. Like, so, for me as an extrovert, the pandemic has been difficult, not because I'm alone. I actually like living alone. I like my space the way it is, and I like that, obviously. But it's been hard because I've been locked in.
Right.
And so what I like to be in motion, as I like to say. I like to be out and about, and my apartment is a home base to shower and to keep my stuff and to sleep and to recharge. But I like to be out in the world.
Sure.
And I haven't been able to do that enough.
Right.
Even though sometimes I like being out in the world, I travel alone a lot and so on. And, it's interesting reflecting on this. I have an episode on flaneuring, on wandering a city alone.
Oh, yeah.
And I was going to put it as part of the Solitude series, and I decided that I wouldn't, in part because I wanted to publish it. I was so excited about it. It's a really wonderful episode. But also the author, this guy, Federico, who wrote this book about flaneuring, had talked about is that you're not truly alone as a flaneur. You are amongst the crowd.
Right, yes.
And I like to flaneur. I like to walk a city alone, in part because it connects you to the crowd. But I think now, in hindsight, talking to you, I could have very easily put.
So that's alone in a crowd is some people's definition of solitude, right?
That's right.
Right. And for some people find that, I'm sure you discussed it, so liberating to be able to wander around in a city and be able to take in the sights and the sounds, but not know anybody. So there's a freedom in that experience, but you still get to absorb the energy of the people and maybe interact a little bit here and there and really get a sense of where you are.
He makes an argument that you can't flaneur with two people. You can't truly flaneur
Right. Yeah.
because it's not you're not really wandering.
Yeah.
Because one will exert his or her will
Right.
on the other one.
Interesting.
To do this.
Yeah.
And so you lack that kind of freedom. So the other thing, just as I'm thinking about my life, forgive me for this, but when I was a younger man, we would do these New Year's trips every year. And it was a group of us, sometimes it was a small group, sometimes it was a huge group, a dozen people or so. And we would go somewhere, and it was very social, out every night, doing stuff all day. And at some point in the trip, I would tell my friends, and remind you, I'm an extrovert, and I was one of the sort of leaders of this group. I would often plan these trips. I'd be like, I'm staying in. Go out without me, kind of thing. And I just needed a night to myself. So that's me as an extrovert, and it's pretty obvious why I sort of tend to like people around me. But even as an extrovert, I need some of that alone time, in part because I like the freedom. People are still stressful and so on. But it seems to me very clear that the introverts of the world are going to prefer more solitude.
Yeah. And I mean, that's true. Of course, introversion and extroversion are much broader traits than just about being around people and being alone, right? They have to do with impulsivity and sociability and risk-taking. And, there's a lot of different things that differentiate people who are more extroverted and more introverted. And I also think it's really important to say, we use terms like extrovert and introvert. But these are personality traits that go from, 0 to 100, if that's your range, across everybody in the world. And everybody's somewhere on that scale. And it's not like at this point and higher, you're an extrovert, and at this point and lower, you're an introvert. Most people, in fact, have characteristics of both. Right. So there's only maybe 10 to 15%. And just at that high end, that would have all of those traits and characteristics and at each end. And so the vast majority of people in the world are, both, right? They have some characteristics of extroversion or some characteristics of introversion and are somewhere on kind of that sliding scale. But you're right. Generally speaking, introverts might feel more energized when they spend time alone. It's a chance for restoration. It's a chance to be, removed from too much stimulation, which is often something that happens to people who are introverted. But I will say this, and it's perhaps a controversial set of findings. When we are around other people and interacting with them, it generally makes us happier, even if we're introverted.
I see.
Okay. So, for example, there's this great study where these guys in Europe approached a whole bunch of people before they got on a commuter train. Okay. And they gave them some personality tests and they measured their mood. And then they said to half of them, you sit by yourself. And the other randomly determined half, you initiate a conversation with someone on the train. And when they caught up with them an hour later, regardless of how introverted or extroverted they were, so for everybody, speaking to someone on the train, they had a more positive mood. They were in a better mood when they got off the train. And my colleague at Carleton University, John Zelensky, has done some amazing work where he actually forces introverts to act like extroverts. Okay. So he brings them into the lab and he gives them a script and he tells them, just pretend for the next hour while you are interacting with these other people. I want you to just pretend that you're extroverted and act in that way. Okay. And when extroverts are forced to act as introverts, they generally report being happier afterwards. Okay. On the other hand, extroverts forced to act like introverts, they hate it. It's only a one-way street.
Oh,
right.
Fascinating.
So again, in terms of mood, generally speaking, humans are happier when they are with other people, regardless of their personality. And even if they don't think that they are going to feel happier when they are interacting with others. Now, that's not the only outcome that we're interested in. That's not, that's positive mood. That's one measure of well-being. It's one measure of who we are. There's lots of other things about, spending time alone that might be positive and might offer us benefits besides necessarily, having more positive mood. But it is a bit of a controversial finding because it's been replicated pretty extensively. And it kind of goes against this idea that, that introverts, if we make them act with others, it's going to kind of come at a cost, right?
Yes.
It's going to, yeah.
Well, I think, so these sort of mood effects, I'm not totally surprised by them, but, there are, of course, with limits, right? So if you made introverts act like extroverts all the time,
sure. Then they probably run out of steam, right?
That's right. And, when you talk to someone on a train, they're polite and, and so on. And one of the nice things about our lives mostly is we get to choose whom we
Yes.
spend time with and interact with, and thus
and how we spend and how much of that, right? So,
That's right.
And that gets to, again, when we're talking about causes, it's mostly about choice, right? It's about being in control of how those experiences go. And that's why this pandemic has been so hard, among so many other reasons, is that it's removed a lot of people's choice about how much time they spend alone and how much time they spend with others. And it's created situations where it's always alone or it's always with others.
Yeah.
And again, if it's beyond your control, if that social experience or solitary experience is being imposed upon you and forced upon you from these external circumstances, that's when it's most likely to be the most negative experience, right? Anything that we're forced to do that we don't want to, that we don't have control over, is generally going to be not experienced in a positive way. It's when we choose to do it. That's when it's more likely to. That's getting back to those kind of intrinsic motivations I was talking about before.
Robert, I don't like people telling me what to do. And
you're not alone. Yes.
And so that's been hard on me. So there are these sort of mood benefits sort of to often being with others. But this has been a topic of conversation in a lot of previous episodes, including an episode on what makes a life remarkable, is that as humans, we're not always pursuing positive emotions.
Correct.
Also, what has been a topic here is this fancy word that I use a lot on the podcast called heterogeneity. That is that we are different. We have different values. We have different beliefs. We have different lifestyles. Those things change depending on where we are in life. They change depending on context. So, you were just talking about introversion versus extroversion as a trait, but it can also be as a state, right? You can actually have a context that makes you skew one way or the other. And when it comes to heterogeneity, is that other people live remarkable lives, not just by experiencing more positive emotion, but by doing other kinds of things. So, for example, things that are meaningful or creative and so on. And so let's talk about some of those benefits a little bit more of solitude.
Oh, I'm really glad you put it so explicitly, because I tried to make it clear that, positive mood is not the be all and end all. Of course, it's something that can contribute towards well-being, but it is by far not the only thing that contributes towards well-being. And you talked about meaning, and you talked about self-exploration, and some of these things, creativity, spiritual experiences, some of these things that we think solitude affords us, you just can't get as well in other circumstances and other kinds of contexts, right? And that's the critical thing. And again, it's all about balance. And I love that you're using the term heterogeneity, because solitude is heterogeneous, right? It is different things. It can mean different things. It can be caused by different things, and it's experienced very differently by different types of people. And that's what helps make it so complicated. And that's why we have all these kind of, mixed and, almost paradoxical findings in the literature about solitude being all these different things at the same time.
What I want to do is I want to normalize someone's desire for solitude.
Right. Yes.
I don't want someone to not pursue solitude because they're afraid they're going to be lonely.
Yeah.
Because if they want it and they're using that time well, they're probably not going to be lonely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to normalize the fact that some people want lots of it, other people don't.
Yep.
I want to ask you about some of the predictors of a desire for solitude, and also whether people experience solitude aversely or not.
Right. Yeah. So, there's a researcher named Luke Goossens, and he talks about affinity for aloneness versus aversion for aloneness. Okay. And I think that's an interesting way to look at kind of the approach and avoidance of solitude, right? So people who have an affinity for aloneness generally enjoy and like spending time alone. And then people who have an aversion for aloneness generally find solitary time unpleasant and aversive, right? Now, I actually think that solitude should be something that everybody should experience, right? Now, how much depends on you. And we've made a point of trying to sort of repeat that. But I think, a little bit of it is good for everybody. Right. Okay. I think it's almost to be prescribed, again, not by a specific amount, but there are people who are really averse to spending time alone could probably benefit from spending a little bit more time alone. Just like people who are averse to spending time with others could probably benefit from spending a little bit more time with others. And again, it's all about finding that balance. And again, just to repeat, because it's so critical, is that balance is different for everybody. And that there's a huge range about what is kind of normal and okay in people. That heterogeneity of experience of solitude is should be normalized, right? There is not a prescribed amount of time alone. There's not a Surgeon General's recommendation of you need to spend X amount of time alone, right? It's something that people need to kind of sort out for themselves, and mostly through trial and error. Right. And what I often suggest that people do is to keep a little diary for a week or two about monitor, your solitary and your social times, monitor your mood, and see if you can see sort of connections between the two over, a period of a week or 2 weeks or something. And then maybe try to make some adjustments if you can see a pattern of of your mood worsening after certain amounts of time alone, certain qualities of experiences with others. Because again, it's not something that we're kind of triggered to pay attention to, which is whether or not our need for solitude is being met. And for a lot of people, they might, have this free floating feeling of being grumpy or sad and not know where it's coming from. And it could be figured out just by monitoring their social and solitary experiences over some period of time.
Okay, so that's about the amount. And then also, I think if I would press this diary a little bit, is also to pay attention to how you're using that time.
Yes, alone. The quality of that experience, very much so. Yeah.
And how is that helping you, as I say, live a remarkable life? So are you using that time to reflect, to journal, to make something? So Robert, I have this thing is create more than you consume.
Right.
And so, for example, you can be alone sitting on the couch consuming a television show, watching a movie or something like that. And that may be restorative. You're tired at the end of the day. It may light you up, aesthetically pleasing. It's a documentary you're learning and so on. But you could also be writing something or painting or putting something together or whatever, whatever that creative endeavor is that also can transport you into a flow state, which is pleasurable, in which ironically time seems to disappear when you're in a flow state. So suddenly you may spend hours and hours alone and you don't even notice that time has passed.
Yeah. So, I think it's really important that you're talking about the quality of your solitude, the quality of your alone time. And we've actually have some preliminary results to suggest that, you could be spending a lot of time alone and still be feeling alone. And the reason for that is because you're not engaged in these kinds of meaningful, intrinsically motivated solitary activities, right? So you're not doing a hobby, you're not listening to music, you're not reading, you're not creating, right? Instead, you might be, ruminating or worrying or, wandering around aimlessly or maybe just, staring at a screen. And those kinds of experiences don't satisfy the need for solitude in the same way that these, I mentioned, intrinsically motivated, engaged, meaningful experiences do.
Yeah. So, a previous guest who sort of talked about and a lot of this sort of is trite, humans are social creatures and all this kind of stuff.
They are. Yes, I agree. But that doesn't change anything that we've talked.
Exactly. And I sort of imagine hunter-gatherer societies, And so, yes, you need the crowd. You need the team. You need some people hunting and some people gathering and some people making the meals and some people caring for the children and sharing these responsibilities. And if you went it alone, you're going to have a hard time. Now, however, there were people in there who were, in the thick of it more and people more on the edges, right? And there were people who were like, I'm going to go out hunting alone today, or I'm going to go out gathering alone today. And some of that is they just need a break from that smelly, annoying person, you know what I mean? Or they're having a disagreement with a partner or a friend or something. But some of it is they just want to collect their thoughts and they just want to.
But again, you're talking, from an evolutionary perspective, there's a reason why we still have introverts and extroverts in the world, right? It's good for humans as a species that not everybody is bouncing off the wall extroverted, risk-taking, sociable, right? Not looking before they leap, running off and doing things in large groups. It's good that we have some of those people, but it's also good that we have people who are a little slower, a little quieter, who might think a little bit before they act, who might reflect and plan and organize a little bit, or, right? There's a reason why these differences, this heterogeneity, sorry, I'm really honing in on that word, still exists today because all aspects of that continuum are good for us under different circumstances. And so it's good for the species as a whole that we have this variability. We have people who are more one way and more another way. And I think, when people say people are social animals and that, we should all be spending time together, that can be true. And it can also be true that we need to spend time alone. Like, these are not either ors. Right. And I think it's a gross oversimplification to discount one because of the other. And you can feel lonely and alonely at the same time, right? You can be spending time with people, but not high quality time.
Oh, yeah.
And so you're just dissatisfied with that part of your life. And then when you do get to spend time alone, it's not enough, or it's not doing stuff that you want to be because you've got too much, chores to do or something. And so you could, these are not mutually exclusive things either, right? You could be dissatisfied with multiple components of your social and asocial life.
Yes. So said another way, it's naive to just say humans are social, so we should be more social.
Right.
And
yeah.
I think that's great.
It's just one thing. Yeah.
That's right. And one of the things, too, is we no longer live in a hunter-gatherer world, right? Mm-hmm. So we actually have, and I did a whole episode on innovations that have spurred the rise of single living, right? So really what has happened is, as a result of being able to afford to live on your own because of the rise of apartments, or birth control because, you can still now have sex and then not have to have a family as a result of it, or even things like washers and dryers and so on that allow, there's a lot of things that allow the urbanization of the
access to food and access to critical resources that you would normally have to be in a group in order to make sure that you got it. Now you can get it on your own.
Now I have DoorDash. Right. Exactly. And what has happened is, as a result of that, you've seen an increase in people living alone. Right. Mostly because they can. There was a time no one lived alone because it was impossible.
Well, people probably have always wanted to, but now the circumstances exist that people are able to and they're able to have. And so they're probably happier as a result.
Indeed.
Right. So if the circumstances were such that there was less choice, and so that people with these characteristics who might have been happier spending more time by themselves, but couldn't because society was not at a point where it was possible, now they are able to do that. I think that's wonderful.
Yes. And these are my listeners, not all of them, but many of my listeners. These are solos, and I would say this, there is some element to the average listener who does appreciate more solitude than the average non-listener, is my sense of this.
Okay. Yeah.
One quick thing, this is a weird fact. I came across this. Some evolutionary biologist or someone has a hypothesis about the value of loners, right? So a loner is someone on the far end, right?
Right.
These are not people who are sort of in the middle to your Goldilocks hypothesis. They're on the far end of desiring solitude and so on. Is that there's actually an evolutionary benefit of those people.
Okay.
Which is in the case of a mass extinction event.
Yeah, right.
Right? So having loners spread throughout the world, so imagine if the pandemic came along and just wiped out 95% of society.
Right.
Right? Well, it's those loners who would actually, in theory, come together and restart.
Yeah, or whether they would come together or not, I guess, is another question.
Well, it's a good point, but that is one of the benefits of having.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And so even our loners are valuable to us. Yeah. And my argument, and this is something I don't know, is when it comes to things like art and science, scholarship, ideas, do we find those coming out of people who are sort of disproportionately comfortable with solitude? That is, that solitude actually makes the world, whether it be, innovation, culture, art, and so on, more rich.
Yeah, there's certainly tons of anecdotes and stories and books written about people who have removed themselves from society to different degrees in order to facilitate the pursuit of their science or art or et cetera. And there's a lot of those. And again, the anecdote doesn't prove the theory, but it's pretty compelling when you listen to the stories. And it's hard to imagine those types of accomplishments occurring in other circumstances.
Indeed. I want to finish with two things. One is a set of prescriptions. And so you've already given one, which is and I'm a big believer in journaling, diarying. Is that a word? Writing in a diary, whatever you would call it. Journaling to reflect. And so you sort of suggested people track this stuff and be able to reflect it.
Yeah.
Are there any other prescriptions for someone who's listening to this who wants to sort of experiment, lean into solitude, that might help them kind of figure out their sweet spot, so to speak?
Right. Sure. So, well, I guess a few things. One would be, if you're trying to see how you like experiencing solitude, it doesn't have to be a 3-hour, trek in the forest, right? And just like anything else, you can start small, even if it's just, a few minutes here and there, or a walk around the block, or, just sitting alone with your thoughts on the couch for a few minutes. It's not like a race to see who can spend more time alone and feel okay, right? So and by experimenting a little bit and starting at a smaller amount, and then, comfortably moving forward as you are, having positive experiences, that will allow you to find where your sweet spot is. And so I think that would be kind of one piece of advice. And I think another kind of general piece of advice is it should be okay to talk to other people about these needs and about these experiences, because there's a lot of people out there for whom solitude only means a punishment, right? It only means something bad. And even if you are living alone, you are still interacting with people. You're making plans. You're going out. You're seeing your friends. Maybe not so much right now, but you will be again. And, if you want to stay home on a Friday night because you need some me time, you don't have to say you're washing your hair, right? You don't have to make up an excuse, or you shouldn't have to. It should be okay to say, I'm just taking a little time for myself tonight. And that should be just fine. Right. That doesn't mean that you don't like the people who you were supposed to see. It doesn't mean that you're not, interested in a relationship with a person who you were supposed to spend time with, who are spending time with. Right. Those types of, needing some time for yourself should be okay. And it should be okay to express that need.
Yeah. To prioritize it and to own it. To not be embarrassed about it. Not
exactly. 100%. Right. Yeah. And that's a job of that we can help with, is just, raising awareness and educating that this kind of stuff is, like you said, it's normalized and it's part of being human, right? Just like wanting to spend time with others is part of being human, and being a social animal, being a solitary animal sometimes is also part of being human. And it's that, both sides of those coins should be valued.
Yeah. So if someone takes, in my opinion, if someone takes anything away from this, is the normalization of solitude, and that if you want lots and lots of it, there's nothing wrong with you. Yep. And if you don't want much of it, there's nothing wrong with you.
Right. And I agree completely. And just to add to that, I would say making sure also that there is a balance, right? And that it's, it is possible to spend too much time with others. It's possible also to spend too much time alone. And what is normal for any one person, as we've said, is going to be quite different. And there's going to be a range there. And maybe whichever one you feel like you're not getting enough of on both sides of those coins, it might ultimately be good for you to push yourself just a bit to get a little bit more on both sides, right? And again, like we've talked about the importance of normalizing wanting to spend time alone. And just like I said before, it doesn't also discount the importance of having relationships and having interactions. And we do benefit from those things. It's just, again, it's not all or nothing, right? Doesn't always have to be one or the other. We should be striving to improve our, quality of experiences in both contexts. And that, I think, will make the largest contribution to our well-being.
Well said. Last thing. Let's talk about relationship status.
Okay.
Right. So let's talk about being single and solitude. So I always talk about how singles need to have a team. Mm-hmm. And the research bears this out, that singles, especially those who are living a remarkable life, are more interconnected than their partnered peers.
Okay.
Right. And so Bella said this phrase, I think she got it from someone else. Married people have the one. Single people have the ones.
Right.
And so just because you're single doesn't mean you're alone. Like you may have a rich group of colleagues and friends, and you may be volunteering and traveling and connected to the world in many ways, or less so, right, along that lines. But in your research or in the work in general, is there a finding with regard to relationship status, single versus non-single, on these different
so we haven't reached the point yet where we've looked at that specific variable, like whether or not you are single or married or with a partner, et cetera, and looking at aloneliness. But from everything we know about people who are single, is that they're also a heterogeneous group, Right? And that some people who are single are going to want to spend a lot of time with other people. You can be a single person who is very extroverted and who loves spending time with other people, but you happen to live by yourself. Mm-hmm. You can be a single person who loves and enjoys, high quality solitary time. Again, I guess I would just say, especially if your listeners are more likely to be single, is that you're going to see the same kind of variability and the same kind of individual differences in everybody, regardless of your marital status, right? So marital status doesn't determine your personality, and it doesn't even determine how much you enjoy or, the quality of your solitary experiences. Everything that we've talked about on all those different factors, I think would apply to people who are married and to people who are single.
I agree. I'm going to add one hypothesis, though, to this.
Okay, yeah.
And that is, if you are married, especially with children, and you desire solitude, it may be harder to get.
I completely agree. Yeah, and that's probably, that's the stereotype, right? If you are a parent, especially these days, if you're a parent alone with your kids, being educated at home and just don't get you're breaking up the wine glass at 2:00 in the afternoon and just to get yourself through the day. And part of the reason is because you don't have any me time, right? And there's huge amounts of stresses associated with that. And that's actually a population I'm really interested in terms of, I think that's where we're going to find peak Aloneliness is in, parents of young children who are dealing with all of the strains of those circumstances.
Yes, indeed. And so, one of the things I always talk about is that solos have optionality. They have opportunity. They have freedom. So you can pull levers.
Right.
Assuming, again, you have a team, you
Correct.
can pull levers, which is, tonight I want to myself. Tomorrow night I want to go out, or vice versa.
Right. And that is exactly what we know about experiences of solitude, is that they are very much determined by the causal factors, right? And again, if the cause is beyond your control, if you're a child and you're playing alone because you're isolated because you have no friends, or that you're being excluded or victimized, that's, in many ways a worst possible experience of solitude. If you are moved to a new city and you're gregarious and outgoing and you don't know anybody and you're stuck alone all the time, you're going to feel lonely. You're isolated because of your circumstances, right? What you just described is the opposite, right? This is someone who has control over their social circumstances and can make internal decisions about what is going to be best for them. And it's under those circumstances that you're most likely to have the most positive experiences of solitude. And I think that's what it boils down to, is having those kinds of choice points and control over your circumstances that gives the best opportunity to experience solitude positively.
Robert, we're going to end on that note. That's a fantastic idea. You're doing important work, and I want to thank you for that. I think that I'm learning about this stuff. I've sort of intuited it along the way, but I needed someone to provide the language and the research and the ideas here. And I think you've done a great service to listeners for them to feel more normal with regard to what their desires and their feelings and their experiences with their alone time and non-alone time. And I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. It's been really fun. I've enjoyed our chat.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.com. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.